In the silence of a military corridor at 2:47 a.m., the sound of a body hitting concrete echoed through the empty hallway. What happened in those next 72 hours would expose a web of corruption, betrayal, and power that reached the highest levels of command. This is not a story of war or combat heroism. This is the story of Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, a woman who discovered that sometimes the most dangerous enemies were the same uniform you do. When Sarah's broken body was found at the bottom of the administrative building's stairwell, the official report called it an accident. But accidents don't leave defensive wounds on someone's hands. Accidents don't require 3 generals to suddenly take emergency control of an entire military base. And accidents certainly don't make 23 witnesses disappear into reassignments across 3 different continents within a single week. What Sarah had uncovered in those files would have ended careers, triggered congressional investigations, and sent some of America's most decorated officers to federal prison. Instead, it nearly ended her life and changed the course of military justice forever. This is her story, and the story of how 3 men with more stars on their shoulders than conscience in their hearts thought they could bury the truth along with the woman who found it. The truth, as Sarah would later say from her hospital bed, has a way of crawling back up those stairs, no matter how far you push it down. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun had always been the kind of officer who followed orders without question, until the day she found the files that would make questioning everything a matter of survival. It was a Tuesday evening in November when she first noticed the discrepancies in the procurement reports that would eventually lead to her lying broken at the bottom of a stairwell. Fort Davidson had been Sarah's assignment for 8 months, a prestigious posting to the base's Financial Oversight Division. She had earned her position through 15 years of exemplary service, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and a reputation for catching financial irregularities that others missed. Her colleagues respected her attention to detail, and her superiors valued her ability to find problems before they became scandals. What none of them expected was that she would uncover the biggest scandal in the base's 50-year history. The investigation began innocently enough. Sarah was reviewing quarterly ammunition procurement records when she noticed that the numbers didn't add up. According to the purchase orders, Fort Davidson had bought enough ammunition in the past year to supply a division twice their size. Yet the inventory reports showed standard levels of munitions on hand. Either someone was falsifying inventory records, or massive quantities of military-grade ammunition were disappearing into unauthorized hands. Sarah's first instinct was to assume clerical error. Military bureaucracy was notorious for generating paperwork mistakes that could take weeks to unravel. She spent her lunch breaks for 3 days cross-referencing delivery receipts, storage manifests, and authorization codes. Each document she reviewed made the discrepancy larger, not smaller. Someone wasn't making mistakes. Someone was deliberately moving ammunition off the books. The discovery that changed everything came on a Friday evening when most of the administrative staff had gone home for the weekend. Sarah was working late, using the quiet hours to dig deeper into the procurement records without interruption. She had requested access to archived files going back 3 years, hoping to determine when the discrepancies had started. What she found in those archives was evidence of a systematic operation that had been running for much longer than she had imagined. The pattern was sophisticated and carefully hidden. Every 6 months, procurement orders would be submitted for routine ammunition purchases. The orders were always approved by the proper authorities and processed through legitimate channels. The ammunition would arrive on schedule and be signed for by authorized personnel. But somewhere between the loading dock and the storage bunkers, significant portions of each shipment would vanish. The paperwork would be adjusted to show smaller deliveries, and the missing ammunition would disappear completely from the official record. Sarah calculated that over the past 3 years, more than 4 million rounds of various ammunition types had been systematically stolen from Fort Davidson. The street value of the missing munitions exceeded $12 million. This wasn't a few soldiers selling spare rounds for drinking money. This was an organized criminal operation operating within the United States military. The deeper Sarah dug, the more dangerous her position became, though she didn't realize it at the time. The theft operation required participation from multiple levels of the base hierarchy. Someone in procurement was approving falsified orders. Someone in transportation was redirecting shipments. Someone in inventory was doctoring the storage records. And someone with significant authority was protecting all of them. Sarah's investigation led her to examine personnel records for everyone with access to the ammunition storage areas. She cross-referenced work schedules with delivery dates, looking for patterns that might identify the people involved in the theft operation. What she discovered was that 3 individuals appeared on duty during every single questionable ammunition delivery over the past 3 years. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb had been the supervising NCO for ammunition storage for 4 years. His record showed commendations for maintaining accurate inventory and preventing theft. Yet somehow, millions of dollars worth of ammunition had disappeared on his watch without him noticing. Either Webb was incompetent beyond belief, or he was a central figure in the theft operation. Captain James Morrison was the logistics officer responsible for coordinating ammunition deliveries with outside suppliers. His signature appeared on every delivery authorization that preceded a theft incident. Morrison had been passed over for promotion twice, despite positive performance reviews. Sarah wondered if financial motivation might have made him receptive to corruption. The third name on Sarah's list was the one that made her hands shake as she wrote it down. Colonel Michael Brennan was the base's deputy commander, the second highest-ranking officer at Fort Davidson. Brennan's authorization was required for any ammunition purchase exceeding a certain threshold. Every major theft incident had occurred shortly after Brennan had signed off on a large procurement order. Sarah sat alone in her office, staring at the evidence she had compiled. If she was right, a colonel was involved in stealing military ammunition worth millions of dollars. If she was wrong, she was about to accuse a decorated officer of serious crimes based on circumstantial evidence. Either way, her career was about to take a dramatic turn. The smart thing would have been to take her findings to the base commander immediately. But Sarah had learned caution during her years of investigating financial irregularities. Sometimes the people who seemed most trustworthy were the ones most skilled at hiding their crimes. Before she accused anyone, she needed more concrete evidence. Sarah decided to conduct surveillance on the ammunition storage area during the next scheduled delivery. According to the procurement schedule, a major ammunition shipment was due the following Tuesday. If her theory was correct, and if the pattern held, some of that ammunition would never make it to the official inventory. She spent the weekend planning her observation operation. The ammunition storage bunkers were located in a restricted area of the base, but Sarah's security clearance gave her legitimate access. She would need to find a position where she could observe the loading dock without being detected. More importantly, she would need to document whatever she saw with photographs that could serve as evidence. Tuesday morning arrived gray and cold. Sarah reported for her regular duties, trying to maintain normal routines while her mind focused on the evening surveillance mission. She had brought a digital camera with a telephoto lens hidden in her office desk until she would need it. Her plan was to leave the administrative building after normal duty hours, as if heading home, then circle back to the storage area under cover of darkness. The ammunition truck arrived at exactly 1800 hours, just as the delivery schedule had indicated. Sarah watched from her chosen observation point behind a maintenance building, camera ready. What she witnessed over the next 2 hours confirmed her worst suspicions and added details that made the situation even more serious than she had imagined. Staff Sergeant Webb was indeed present for the delivery, directing the unloading operation with practiced efficiency. But he wasn't working alone. Sarah counted 8 soldiers involved in moving the ammunition from the delivery truck to the storage bunkers. That was twice the normal crew size for such operations. More telling, she recognized several faces that had no business being involved in ammunition handling. Through her telephoto lens, Sarah watched as the delivery crew separated the incoming ammunition into 2 groups. The larger group was moved toward the official storage bunkers, where it would be properly inventoried and secured. but a significant portion was loaded onto base vehicles and driven toward the seldom-used maintenance area on the far side of the installation. Sarah followed at a distance, using her knowledge of the base layout to stay hidden while maintaining visual contact with the vehicles. What she saw next left no doubt that she had uncovered a major criminal operation. The diverted ammunition was being transferred to civilian trucks parked behind the motor pool building. The civilian vehicles had no military markings and no apparent authorization to be on the base. Sarah photographed everything she could safely document: the faces of the soldiers involved, the license plates of the civilian trucks, the systematic transfer of military ammunition to unauthorized vehicles. She had enough evidence to trigger a major investigation and enough documentation to support serious criminal charges. What Sarah didn't know, as she carefully made her way back to her quarters that night, was that she had also been photographed. Staff Sergeant Webb had spotted her telephoto lens glinting in the security lights during the ammunition transfer operation. While Sarah was building her case against the theft ring was already planning their response to her discovery. The next morning, Sarah arrived at her office early, eager to organize her evidence and determine the best way to report what she had discovered. She found her office door unlocked and her desk drawers slightly ajar. Someone had searched her workspace during the night. Her computer showed signs of being accessed, and several files had been opened that she hadn't touched the previous day. Sarah's first impulse was to check on the digital camera containing the surveillance photographs. She had hidden it in her desk's locked bottom drawer, inside a folder of routine administrative forms. The camera was still there, but the memory card had been removed. Months of investigation and a night of dangerous surveillance had been erased in a few minutes of unauthorized access. Sarah realized that her situation had changed dramatically overnight. She was no longer an investigator uncovering evidence of crimes. She was now a target of criminals who knew she was investigating them. The theft ring had resources, organization, and access that she had underestimated. They had searched her office without triggering security alarms, accessed her computer without leaving obvious traces, and stolen evidence while leaving her personal belongings untouched. The message was clear. They knew who she was, they knew what she had discovered, and they had the capability to reach her anywhere on the base. Sarah spent the day considering her options while maintaining a facade of normal activity. She could report the break-in to base security, but that would require explaining why someone might want to search her office. She could report her investigation findings to the base commander, but she no longer had the photographic evidence that made her accusations credible. Or she could continue investigating, knowing that she was now operating under hostile surveillance. The decision was made for her that evening. As Sarah worked late in her office, trying to reconstruct her evidence from memory and remaining documents, she heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The administrative building was supposed to be empty after 2,000 hours, but someone was moving through the corridors with obvious familiarity with the layout. Sarah quietly locked her office door and turned off her desk lamp, hoping to avoid detection. Through her window, she could see 3 figures walking across the parking lot toward the building entrance. Even in the dim lighting, she recognized Colonel Brennan's distinctive silhouette. The deputy base commander was making an unscheduled visit to the administrative building, accompanied by 2 other men Sarah didn't recognize. The footsteps stopped outside Sarah's office. Someone tried the door handle, found it locked, and began working on the lock with tools that suggested professional skills. Sarah grabbed the most important documents from her desk and moved toward the window, hoping to escape before the intruders gained entry to her office. The window opened onto a courtyard that connected to the main pedestrian walkway through the base. Sarah dropped her documents to the ground outside, then climbed through the window as quietly as she could manage. Behind her, she heard the office door open and voices entering the room she had just vacated. Sarah gathered her scattered papers and moved quickly toward the stairwell that would take her to the building's main exit. Her plan was to reach the base security office and report the break-in using the incident to trigger an investigation that would expose the ammunition theft operation. What she didn't anticipate was that Colonel Brennan had anticipated her likely escape routes. Sarah was halfway down the stairwell when she heard movement above her. Someone was descending the stairs behind her, moving faster than someone taking a casual walk. She increased her pace, taking the concrete steps two at a time while trying to maintain her balance. The exit was one floor below, and safety was less than 30 seconds away. The attack came without warning. Sarah felt hands grab her shoulders from behind, spinning her around to face her attacker. In the dim stairwell lighting, she could see Colonel Brennan's face, but his expression was nothing like the professional demeanor she had seen during official meetings. This was the face of someone who saw her as a threat to be eliminated. Sarah tried to break free from Brennan's grip, but his hands shifted to her throat, cutting off her ability to scream for help. She managed to scratch his face and break partially free, but her position on the stairs made escape nearly impossible. Brennan's response was swift and violent. His hands moved to her chest and pushed with enough force to send her tumbling backward down the concrete stairwell. Sarah's world became a chaos of pain and terror as her body struck the stairs repeatedly during her fall. She felt her left arm snap against the metal handrail, heard her ribs crack when her torso hit the concrete steps. Her head struck the wall twice before her broken body finally came to rest on a landing one floor below. Through waves of pain and approaching unconsciousness, Sarah could hear Colonel Brennan descending the stairs toward her motionless form. She tried to move, tried to call out, but her body would no longer respond to her commands. Brennan knelt beside her and checked for a pulse, his fingers cold against her neck. Sarah heard him speak into a radio, reporting that he had found Lieutenant Colonel Chen unconscious at the bottom of the administrative building stairwell. His voice carried the perfect tone of concerned authority as he called for medical assistance and notified base security of the apparent accident. To anyone listening to the radio transmission, Colonel Brennan sounded like a responsible officer discovering an injured colleague. As Sarah drifted toward unconsciousness, she could hear additional footsteps in the stairwell. The two men who had accompanied Brennan were now examining the scene, discussing how to ensure that Sarah's fall looked accidental. One of them mentioned removing any documents she might have been carrying, while the other suggested adjusting the position of her body to make the injuries more consistent with an accidental fall. The last thing Sarah remembered before losing consciousness was the sound of Colonel Brennan's voice giving orders to his companions. Her investigation was being buried along with her broken body. The ammunition theft operation would continue, protected by officers willing to commit murder to preserve their criminal enterprise. But Sarah Chun was not as easy to kill as they had assumed, and her survival would prove to be the thread that would eventually unravel their entire operation. The emergency medical team arrived at Fort Davidson's administrative building within 6 minutes of Colonel Brennan's call. Paramedic Staff Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez had responded to hundreds of emergency calls during her military career, but something about this scene immediately struck her as wrong. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen's injuries were too severe and too specific for a simple fall downstairs. Rodriguez noted defensive wounds on Sarah's hands, bruising around her throat that suggested strangulation, and an impact pattern on her skull that indicated multiple blows rather than a single fall. Her professional instincts told her this was an assault, not an accident. But when she attempted to voice her concerns to Colonel Brennan, she was quickly cut off and told to focus on medical treatment rather than speculation about causes. The base hospital's emergency room became the next stage in what would prove to be an elaborate cover-up operation. Dr. Captain Michael Foster was the attending physician when Sarah's unconscious form arrived by ambulance. His initial examination confirmed Rodriguez's suspicions about the nature of Sarah's injuries. The pattern of trauma was inconsistent with an accidental fall and suggested violent assault by another person. Dr. Foster began preparing his preliminary report, noting the suspicious circumstances and recommending that base security conduct a thorough investigation. However, Before he could complete his documentation, he received an unexpected visit from the base's senior medical officer, Colonel Patricia Hayes. Hayes informed Foster that the incident was being classified as an accident and that his report should reflect that conclusion. When Foster protested that the medical evidence contradicted an accidental cause, Colonel Hayes reminded him that military medicine sometimes required accepting explanations that served broader interests. She suggested that Foster's career advancement might benefit from demonstrating appropriate discretion in sensitive cases. The implication was clear: write the report as directed, or face consequences that could end his military career. Dr. Foster spent the night struggling with his conscience while Sarah remained unconscious in the intensive care unit. He had taken an oath to provide honest medical assessment regardless of political pressure. Yet he also understood the reality of military hierarchy and the price of defying senior officers. By morning, he had decided to compromise his professional ethics in favor of career preservation. The official medical report described Sarah's injuries as consistent with an accidental fall down concrete stairs. Dr. Foster documented head trauma, multiple fractures, and internal injuries that could reasonably result from such an accident. He omitted mention of the defensive wounds, throat bruising, and suspicious impact patterns that had initially caught his attention. While medical personnel were being pressured to support the accident narrative, Colonel Brennan was coordinating with his criminal associates to eliminate any remaining evidence of Sarah's investigation. Staff Sergeant Webb conducted a thorough search of Sarah's office, removing all documents related to ammunition procurement and inventory. Any paperwork that might support Sarah's allegations was destroyed or removed from the base entirely. Captain Morrison was tasked with reviewing computer records to ensure that Sarah's electronic research had been completely erased. He accessed her computer accounts, deleted relevant files, and modified access logs to remove traces of her investigation activities. Morrison also identified other personnel who might have assisted Sarah's research and began monitoring their activities for signs of continued investigation. The scope of the cover-up operation expanded as Brennan realized how extensively Sarah had documented the ammunition theft. Her investigation had touched multiple departments, involved dozens of personnel files, and generated paperwork that could be traced through several administrative systems. Eliminating all evidence of her work required coordination across the entire base command structure. Brennan's solution was to invoke emergency authority protocols that would give him temporary control over base operations. He contacted his superiors at Regional Command, reporting a security incident that required immediate investigation and possible lockdown of base facilities. The exact nature of the security threat was classified, but Brennan's reputation and command rank gave weight to his assessment of the situation. Within 12 hours of Sarah's attack, 3 general officers arrived at Fort Davidson with orders to assume temporary control of base operations. General Robert Harrison, General David Kim, and General Susan Torres represented different branches of military command, but they shared a common interest in containing whatever security breach had triggered Brennan's emergency request. The arrival of the 3 generals marked the beginning of the most systematic cover-up operation in the base's history. General Harrison assumed overall command authority, while General Kim took control of security and personnel matters. General Torres was placed in charge of communications and external affairs with authority to restrict information flow both on and off the base. Their first action was to implement a communications blackout that prevented base personnel from contacting outside authorities or media outlets. All phone lines, internet connections, and radio communications were monitored and restricted. Personnel were informed that the base was under temporary security restrictions due to an ongoing investigation, but no details were provided about the nature of the alleged security threat. General Kim began conducting interviews with personnel who had worked closely with Sarah or had access to ammunition storage areas. These interviews were presented as routine security clearance updates, but their actual purpose was to identify anyone who might have knowledge of Sarah's investigation or the ammunition theft operation. Sergeant Rodriguez, the paramedic who had first questioned Sarah's injuries, found herself transferred to a medical unit in Alaska within 48 hours of the incident. Her reassignment orders cited urgent personnel needs at the remote location, but Rodriguez understood that she was being removed because of her inconvenient observations about Sarah's condition. Dr. Foster received a similar reassignment to a hospital in Germany, despite having no previous request for overseas duty. Other personnel who had interacted with Sarah's investigation were systematically transferred to distant locations under various pretexts. Within a week, nearly 24 people who might have supported Sarah's allegations had been removed from Fort Davidson. The three generals coordinated their activities with military legal authorities to ensure that any potential investigation would be controlled from the beginning. General Torres contacted the military legal office and reported that Fort Davidson had experienced a security incident involving possible theft of sensitive materials. She requested that any legal proceedings be handled through classified channels to protect national security interests. This preemptive legal maneuvering ensured that if Sarah survived and attempted to report the ammunition theft, her allegations would be processed through military justice systems that the three generals could influence or control. Civilian authorities would be excluded from any investigation on grounds of national security and classified operations. Sarah remained unconscious for 3 days following her attack. During this time, the cover-up operation proceeded with military efficiency. Her personal quarters were searched and sanitized, her computer files were completely erased, and her vehicle was removed from the base for detailed examination and cleaning. Any physical evidence that might support her allegations about the ammunition theft was systematically destroyed. When Sarah finally regained consciousness, she found herself in a private hospital room under what her nurses described as protective security. She was told that she had suffered a serious accident and was being kept under medical observation until her condition stabilized. Visitors were restricted, and her access to phones or computers was limited for medical reasons. Sarah's first coherent memories were of the attack in the stairwell and Colonel Brennan's hands pushing her into her fall. But when she attempted to report these memories to the attending medical staff, she was told that head trauma often produced confused or false memories of the period surrounding an accident. Dr. Foster, now under pressure to support the official narrative, assured Sarah that her memories would likely clarify as her brain injury healed. The psychological pressure applied to Sarah during her recovery was subtle but persistent. Medical staff consistently referred to her injuries as resulting from an accident. Security personnel spoke of the importance of base safety and the danger of spreading rumors that might harm base morale. Even her few permitted visitors emphasized how fortunate she was to survive her fall down the stairs. Sarah's attempts to discuss her investigation with medical or security personnel were consistently deflected or ignored. When she mentioned the ammunition theft operation, she was told that head injuries often caused patients to fixate on work-related concerns that seemed more significant than they actually were. Her allegations were dismissed as symptoms of brain trauma rather than legitimate reports of criminal activity. General Harrison visited Sarah personally during her second week of recovery. He presented himself as a concerned senior officer, checking on the welfare of an injured colleague. Harrison expressed sympathy for her accident and assured her that the base command was committed to her full recovery and eventual return to duty. During their conversation, Harrison subtly probed Sarah's memories of the period leading up to her fall. He asked about her work assignments, her stress levels, and whether she had been experiencing any personal difficulties that might have affected her concentration or judgment. His questions were designed to establish a narrative in which Sarah's fall resulted from personal problems rather than criminal assault. Harrison also informed Sarah that her investigation into procurement irregularities had been reviewed by qualified personnel and found to contain significant errors in analysis and interpretation. He suggested that her head injury might have been preceded by a period of confusion or disorientation that affected her work quality. The implication was that Sarah's allegations about ammunition theft resulted from her own mental instability rather than actual criminal activity. Sarah realized during Harrison's visit that she was not simply recovering from an assault. She was the target of a sophisticated operation designed to discredit her allegations and eliminate her as a threat to the criminal enterprise she had discovered. The three generals weren't at Fort Davidson to investigate security problems. They were there to cover up crimes and silence the person who had exposed them. The scope of the conspiracy became clear to Sarah as she observed the systematic changes occurring around her. Personnel who had worked with her were being transferred or reassigned. Documents related to her investigation were disappearing from official files. Even her own medical records were being modified to support the accident narrative and suggest pre-existing mental health issues. Sarah understood that her survival was both a miracle and a problem for the people who had tried to kill her. They couldn't simply finish the job while she was under medical care and observation, but they could use her recovery period to completely destroy her credibility and eliminate any evidence that might support her allegations. The three generals had effectively taken control of Fort Davidson to protect a criminal operation that involved theft of military ammunition worth millions of dollars. They were using their command authority to conduct a cover-up that involved destroying evidence, intimidating witnesses, and discrediting the only person who had uncovered the truth. Sarah's realization of the situation she faced was both terrifying and motivating. She was alone, injured, and surrounded by people who were either part of the conspiracy or under the control of the conspirators. But she was also alive, which meant she still had the opportunity to find a way to expose the truth and seek justice for the crimes that had nearly killed her. During the long hours of her hospital confinement, Sarah began planning her response to the forces arrayed against her. She couldn't trust anyone at Fort Davidson, and she couldn't rely on military channels that had been compromised by the three generals. Her survival and her quest for justice would require resources and allies outside the military system that had betrayed her. The cover-up operation had been thorough and professional, but wasn't perfect. Sarah's attackers had assumed she would either die from her injuries or be successfully discredited if she survived. They hadn't planned for the possibility that she might survive, retain her memories, and find ways to fight back against their conspiracy. Sarah's battle for justice was just beginning, and the three generals who thought they had buried the truth along with her broken body would soon discover that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun was far more dangerous as a survivor than she had ever been as an investigator. Sarah's breakthrough came during her third week of recovery, when an unexpected visitor arrived at the base hospital. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had driven 6 hours from Washington, D.C. after receiving a cryptic phone call from someone who claimed to have information about criminal activity at Fort Davidson. The caller had refused to identify themselves, but had specifically mentioned Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun and suggested that Walsh investigate her recent accident. Walsh specialized in military legal cases and had a reputation for taking on cases that other attorneys avoided. Her client base included whistleblowers, victims of military corruption, and service members who had been wrongfully prosecuted. She understood how military justice systems could be manipulated to protect powerful interests and silence inconvenient voices. The phone call had provided enough specific details about Sarah's situation to convince Walsh that someone with inside knowledge was seeking help. The anonymous caller had mentioned the timing of Sarah's fall, the immediate arrival of three generals to take control of the base, and the systematic transfer of personnel who had worked closely with Sarah. This wasn't random information that could be obtained through casual observation. Walsh's arrival at Fort Davidson created immediate complications for the three generals managing the cover-up operation. As a civilian attorney with no military affiliation, Walsh couldn't be transferred, reassigned, or intimidated through normal military channels. Her presence represented an outside threat that required different containment strategies. General Torres personally met with Walsh at the base security checkpoint, attempting to convince her that Lieutenant Colonel Chun was unavailable for visitors due to medical restrictions. Torres explained that Chun had suffered a serious head injury and was receiving specialized treatment that prohibited outside contact. However, Walsh had researched military medical regulations and knew that conscious patients had rights to legal consultation that couldn't be denied without specific justification. Walsh demanded to speak with the attending physician about Sarah's condition and legal capacity. This request forced Dr. Foster into an uncomfortable position where he had to choose between supporting the general's cover-up and maintaining professional medical standards. Foster's previous compromise of his ethics had been a private matter between himself and his conscience. Now he was being asked to lie directly to a legal professional who could expose his deception. Dr. Foster's decision to tell Walsh the truth about Sarah's condition marked the beginning of the cover-up operations unraveling. He admitted that Sarah was conscious, mentally competent, and capable of making her own decisions about legal representation. Foster also revealed that Sarah had consistently claimed her injuries resulted from an assault rather than an accident, and that her account had never wavered despite pressure to accept the official narrative. Walsh's first meeting with Sarah lasted 3 hours and provided confirmation of everything the anonymous caller had suggested. Sarah described her investigation into ammunition theft, her surveillance operation, and the attack by Colonel Brennan in detail. More importantly, Sarah revealed that she had taken precautions to preserve evidence outside the base's control systems. During the early stages of her investigation, Sarah had made copies of key documents and stored them in a safety deposit box at a bank in the nearby town. She had also maintained personal notes about her findings and created a backup copy of some computer files on an external drive that she kept at her off-base apartment. The three generals' efforts to destroy all evidence had been thorough, but not complete. Walsh immediately recognized the significance of Sarah's revelations and the danger that Sarah continued to face. The attack in the stairwell had been attempted murder, not assault. The arrival of 3 generals to control the base represented a conspiracy at the highest levels of military command. The systematic elimination of witnesses and evidence constituted obstruction of justice on a massive scale. Sarah's decision to trust Walsh with her story was based partly on desperation and partly on the attorney's reputation for fighting powerful interests. Sarah understood that she couldn't win this battle alone, and that time was running out. The longer she remained under the general's control, the more completely they could discredit her and eliminate remaining evidence. Walsh's strategy was to remove Sarah from the base as quickly as possible, while simultaneously securing the evidence that could expose the criminal conspiracy. She filed emergency legal motions demanding Sarah's immediate release from military custody on grounds that she was being held against her will and denied proper legal representation. Walsh also requested federal investigation of the circumstances surrounding Sarah's injuries and the unusual command changes at Fort Davidson. The 3 generals' response to Walsh's legal challenges revealed the extent of their desperation and the resources they were willing to commit to protecting their conspiracy. General Harrison contacted senior Pentagon officials, claiming that Sarah's case involved classified national security matters that required military rather than civilian legal jurisdiction. He requested that all outside legal proceedings be suspended pending completion of an internal military investigation. General Kim attempted to have Walsh's security clearance revoked and her access to the base permanently restricted. He filed reports suggesting that Walsh was potentially working with foreign intelligence services to obtain classified military information through her client. These allegations were entirely fabricated, but they created bureaucratic obstacles that could delay legal proceedings for months. General Torres coordinated a media strategy designed to discredit both Sarah and Walsh before their allegations could gain public attention. Torres contacted military-friendly journalists and provided them with information suggesting that Sarah had experienced a mental breakdown and was being manipulated by an opportunistic attorney seeking publicity and financial gain. Despite these countermeasures, Walsh succeeded in obtaining a federal court order requiring that Sarah be transferred to a civilian hospital pending resolution of her legal status. The order was based on fundamental constitutional principles that military authority couldn't override civilian legal rights without specific justification. Sarah's transfer represented the first major victory against the conspiracy and provided her with protection from further direct retaliation. Sarah's move to Georgetown University Hospital in Washington, D.C. also gave her access to independent medical evaluation that contradicted the official account of her injuries. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a trauma specialist with no military affiliations, examined Sarah and concluded that her injuries were inconsistent with an accidental fall. Dr. Hernandez documented defensive wounds, strangulation marks, and impact patterns that clearly indicated violent assault. The independent medical evaluation provided crucial corroboration for Sarah's account of the attack and undermined the accident narrative that the three generals had constructed. Walsh immediately filed the medical report with federal authorities and requested criminal investigation of attempted murder and conspiracy charges. Meanwhile, Sarah worked with Walsh to retrieve the evidence she had preserved outside the base. The safety deposit box contained photocopies of procurement records showing the systematic theft of ammunition over a 3-year period. Sarah's personal notes included names, dates, and financial calculations that documented the scope of the criminal operation. The external drive held computer files that had been deleted from base systems, but preserved Sarah's analysis of the theft patterns. The evidence package that Sarah and Walsh assembled was comprehensive enough to support federal criminal charges and congressional investigation. However, presenting the evidence required overcoming the national security classification that the three generals had imposed on Sarah's case. Military authorities continued to claim that public disclosure of Sarah's allegations would compromise ongoing security operations and endanger personnel. Walsh's solution was to present Sarah's evidence directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation through channels that bypassed military legal systems. FBI Special Agent Maria Santos specialized in public corruption cases and had experience investigating criminal activity within government agencies. Santos understood that military classification claims were sometimes used to cover up criminal activity rather than protect legitimate security interests. Agent Santos's initial review of Sarah's evidence convinced her that a major federal investigation was warranted. The ammunition theft operation represented millions of dollars in stolen government property being sold to unauthorized buyers. The attack on Sarah constituted attempted murder of a federal employee investigating criminal activity. The cover-up operation involved conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and abuse of military authority. However, Santos also recognized that investigating high-ranking military officers required careful coordination with Department of Justice officials and Pentagon leadership. The FBI couldn't simply arrest three generals without considering the broader implications for military command structure and national security operations. The investigation would need to proceed carefully to ensure that justice was achieved without compromising legitimate military functions. The FBI's entry into Sarah's case marked a turning point that the three generals hadn't anticipated. Their cover-up operation had been designed to control military legal systems and manipulate internal administrative processes. They had assumed that military hierarchy and classification authority would protect them from outside investigation. The involvement of federal law enforcement represented a threat that couldn't be contained through normal military channels. General Harrison's attempts to convince FBI leadership that Sarah's case involved classified operations were unsuccessful. Agent Santos had reviewed Sarah's evidence and determined that the ammunition theft operation had no connection to legitimate military security concerns. The classification claims were clearly being used to obstruct justice rather than protect national security. General Kim's efforts to discredit Sarah's credibility also failed when confronted with independent medical evidence and documentary proof of her allegations. The FBI's investigation confirmed that Sarah's injuries resulted from assault, that ammunition theft had occurred as she claimed, and that evidence had been systematically destroyed to prevent investigation. General Torres's media strategy backfired when investigative journalists began examining the unusual circumstances surrounding Sarah's case. The presence of 3 generals at a routine Army base, the systematic transfer of personnel following Sarah's accident, and the classification of her case raised questions that couldn't be answered without exposing the cover-up operation. Sarah's decision to fight back against the conspiracy had succeeded beyond her initial hopes. What had begun as her desperate attempt to survive and seek justice had evolved into a federal criminal investigation that threatened to expose corruption at the highest levels of military command. The 3 generals who had tried to bury the truth, along with her broken body, now faced the possibility of spending their retirement years in federal prison. The battle for truth was far from over, but Sarah had proved that even the most powerful military conspiracies could be challenged by someone with courage, evidence, and the right legal representation. Her story was becoming a testament to the principle that justice could prevail even when the odds seemed impossible and the enemies seemed untouchable. The 3 generals were about to discover that their military ranks and political connections couldn't protect them from the consequences of attempted murder and criminal conspiracy. Sarah's survival and determination had set in motion events that would ultimately bring down one of the most elaborate cover-up operations in military history. The federal investigation into the Fort Davidson conspiracy expanded rapidly once FBI agent Santos presented Sarah's evidence to the Department of Justice. Within 2 weeks, a joint task force had been assembled involving the FBI, the Department of Defense Inspector General, and the Army Criminal Investigation Division. What had begun as an attempted murder case had evolved into one of the largest military corruption investigations in recent history. The task force's first breakthrough came when Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. Webb had been involved in the ammunition theft operation for 3 years, but his role had been relatively minor compared to the senior officers who had organized and protected the criminal enterprise. His cooperation provided investigators with detailed information about how the theft operation functioned and who was involved at each level. Webb's testimony revealed that the ammunition theft had generated more than $15 million in illegal profits over 4 years. The stolen munitions were being sold to private security companies, foreign governments, and criminal organizations through a network of intermediaries with connections to international arms dealers. Colonel Brennan had organized the operation and recruited participants through a combination of financial incentives and career threats. Captain Morrison's involvement had begun when he faced financial difficulties following his ex-wife's expensive medical treatment. Brennan had offered Morrison a way to earn additional income while performing his regular duties with minimal additional risk. Morrison's logistics responsibilities made him perfectly positioned to coordinate the timing and documentation of ammunition diversions. The investigation also uncovered the identities of the civilian contractors who had been purchasing the stolen ammunition. Several private security firms had been buying military-grade munitions at below-market prices without asking questions about their origin or legal status. These companies had then resold the ammunition to overseas clients, generating enormous profits while maintaining plausible deniability about the illegal source. Webb's cooperation led to the identification of bank accounts, shell companies, and financial records that documented the flow of money from ammunition sales to the personal accounts of the conspirators. Colonel Brennan had accumulated more than $4 million in offshore accounts, while Morrison and Webb had received smaller, but still substantial payments for their participation. The 3 generals' cover-up operation had been motivated by their own involvement in the ammunition theft scheme. General Harrison had been receiving monthly payments from Brennan in exchange for ensuring that higher-level military authorities didn't investigate procurement irregularities at Fort Davidson. General Kim had been providing intelligence about planned inspections and investigations that might threaten the operation. General Torres had been using her communications authority to prevent information about suspicious activities from reaching outside investigators. Sarah's discovery of the theft operation had threatened to expose not just the criminals at Fort Davidson, but a network of corruption that reached into the Pentagon and involved some of the Army's most senior leadership. The three generals' decision to cover up the crimes rather than investigate them had been driven by their own criminal liability rather than legitimate security concerns. The Federal Task Force's investigation methods were more sophisticated than anything the three generals had anticipated. Financial analysts traced money movements through multiple international banking systems, uncovering the complex network of accounts and shell companies used to launder the proceeds from ammunition sales. Computer forensics experts recovered deleted files and communication records that documented the coordination of criminal activities and cover-up efforts. Telecommunications analysis revealed that the three generals had been in regular contact with each other and with Brennan for months before Sarah's attack. Their phone records and email communications showed detailed planning for the cover-up operation, including discussions of how to discredit Sarah and eliminate evidence of the ammunition theft. These communications provided direct evidence of conspiracy that couldn't be explained away as legitimate military coordination. The breakthrough that sealed the case against all conspirators came when investigators discovered that Colonel Brennan had been secretly recording his conversations with the three generals as insurance against potential betrayal. Brennan had apparently learned not to trust his criminal partners and had created an audio record of their discussions about covering up the ammunition theft and silencing Sarah. Brennan's recordings captured General Harrison explicitly ordering that Sarah be prevented from reporting her findings through any means necessary. General Kim could be heard discussing methods for discrediting Sarah's credibility and eliminating witnesses who might support her allegations. General Torres was recorded coordinating the media strategy designed to portray Sarah as mentally unstable and Walsh as an opportunistic attorney exploiting a confused victim. Most damaging was a recording of General Harrison stating that Sarah's death in the stairwell attack would have solved their problems permanently, and expressing regret that she had survived to continue threatening their operation. This audio evidence provided direct proof that the three generals had knowledge of the assault on Sarah and considered it a solution to their criminal exposure. The federal grand jury that reviewed the task force's evidence returned indictments against all four senior officers involved in the conspiracy. Colonel Brennan was charged with attempted murder, conspiracy to commit theft of government property, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The three generals were charged with conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and violation of their oaths of office. The indictments also extended to Morrison, Webb, and 8 other military personnel who had participated in the ammunition theft operation. Several civilian contractors and arms dealers were charged with conspiracy to receive stolen government property and violations of federal firearms regulations. The scope of the criminal case encompassed more than 20 defendants and involved charges that could result in life imprisonment for the most serious offenders. Sarah's role in the prosecution was both crucial and challenging. Her testimony was essential to proving the conspiracy and establishing the motive for the attack on her life. However, testifying against senior military officers required enormous personal courage and subjected her to intense scrutiny from defense attorneys seeking to discredit her account. The defense strategy employed by the three generals' attorneys was to claim that Sarah had suffered brain damage in her fall that affected her memory and judgment. They argued that her allegations were the product of post-traumatic confusion rather than accurate recollection of actual events. This approach required painting Sarah as an unreliable witness whose mental state had been compromised by her injuries. Sarah's response to these attacks on her credibility was to demonstrate through her testimony the same analytical skills and attention to detail that had enabled her to uncover the ammunition theft operation. She presented her evidence methodically and answered defense questions with precision that contradicted any suggestion of mental impairment. Her performance on the witness stand convinced the jury that her account was both accurate and credible. The trial proceedings revealed the full scope of the conspiracy and its impact on military readiness and national security. Expert witnesses testified that the stolen ammunition could have supplied terrorist organizations or hostile foreign governments with advanced military ordnance. The theft operation had not only cost taxpayers millions of dollars, but had potentially compromised American security interests around the world. Colonel Brennan's decision to plead guilty and cooperate with prosecutors provided additional evidence against the three generals and helped expedite the legal proceedings. His testimony confirmed that the generals had been full partners in both the theft operation and the cover-up conspiracy. Brennan's cooperation was motivated partly by his desire for reduced sentencing and partly by his anger at the generals' attempts to make him the sole scapegoat for crimes they had all committed together. The jury's verdict was decisive and comprehensive. All three generals were convicted on all charges, with sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Colonel Brennan received a 30-year sentence despite his cooperation, reflecting the severity of his crimes and his leadership role in both the theft operation and the attack on Sarah. The convictions sent shockwaves through the military establishment and triggered comprehensive reviews of procurement procedures and oversight systems. The Pentagon implemented new safeguards designed to prevent similar theft operations and established independent investigation protocols that couldn't be compromised by command influence. Sarah's victory in court was accompanied by her promotion to full colonel and assignment to a prestigious position in the Pentagon's Financial Oversight Division. Her experience investigating and exposing the Fort Davidson conspiracy made her an ideal candidate for preventing future corruption cases. However, Sarah's greatest satisfaction came from knowing that justice had been achieved and that the people who had tried to kill her were facing the consequences of their crimes. The aftermath of the case extended beyond criminal convictions to civil remedies and institutional reforms. Sarah filed a federal lawsuit against the military for the assault on her life and the violation of her civil rights. The settlement she received was substantial enough to ensure her financial security for life, though no amount of money could fully compensate for the trauma she had endured. The three generals' military pensions were revoked, and their service records were amended to reflect their criminal convictions. Their fall from respected senior officers to convicted felons served as a warning to other military leaders who might be tempted to abuse their authority for personal gain. Sarah's story became a case study taught at military academies and law schools as an example of how individual courage and integrity could triumph over institutional corruption. Her willingness to risk her life to expose the truth had prevented millions of dollars in additional theft and potentially saved lives by keeping dangerous weapons out of the wrong hands. The anonymous phone call that had brought Attorney Walsh into Sarah's case was eventually traced to Dr. Foster, the physician who had been pressured to falsify Sarah's medical records. Foster's conscience had ultimately overcome his fear of career consequences, and his decision to seek outside help had been crucial to Sarah's survival and the exposure of the conspiracy. Dr. Foster faced disciplinary action for his initial cooperation with the cover-up, but his eventual decision to assist Sarah's case resulted in relatively minor consequences. He was transferred to a civilian hospital position where his medical skills could be used without the conflicts of interest that military service had created. The Fort Davidson case became a watershed moment in military justice, demonstrating that even the most powerful officers could be held accountable for criminal behavior when determined individuals were willing to fight for the truth. Sarah's courage in the face of overwhelming odds had proved that justice was possible even when the system itself seemed designed to prevent it. Years later, Sarah would reflect that her survival had been more than just personal good fortune. It had been an opportunity to ensure that the truth couldn't be buried along with her broken body at the bottom of those concrete stairs. The three generals who had thought they could eliminate an inconvenient witness had instead created a determined enemy who would never stop fighting until justice was achieved. The lesson of Sarah's story extended beyond military justice to fundamental principles about the importance of individual courage in confronting institutional corruption. Her case proved that no one is too powerful to be held accountable, and that sometimes a single person's refusal to accept injustice can bring down an entire criminal conspiracy. The stairs that had nearly become Sarah's grave had instead become the foundation of one of the most significant military justice cases in American history. Her survival and determination had ensured that truth would ultimately prevail over corruption, and that those who abused their power would face the consequences of their crimes regardless of their rank or influence. 5 years after the convictions that ended the Fort Davidson conspiracy, Sarah Chinn stood before a congressional committee as they prepared to vote on the most comprehensive military reform legislation in decades. The Chinn Military Accountability Act, named in her honor, would establish independent oversight systems designed to prevent the type of corruption and cover-up that had nearly cost Sarah her life. Sarah's testimony before Congress marked the culmination of her transformation from victim to advocate. The woman who had been pushed down concrete stairs for discovering the truth had become the leading voice for transparency and accountability in military justice. Her expertise, earned through personal suffering and professional courage, made her the most credible spokesperson for reforms that many had considered impossible. The legislation that bore Sarah's name addressed the systematic weaknesses that had enabled the Fort Davidson conspiracy. Independent inspector generals would be appointed from outside the military chain of command, preventing senior officers from controlling investigations of their own criminal activity. Whistleblower protections would be strengthened to ensure that personnel reporting corruption couldn't be silenced through transfers, intimidation, or violence. Sarah's advocacy work had been motivated by her understanding that her case represented broader problems within military culture and institutional systems. The 3 generals who had tried to kill her weren't aberrations, but products of a system that placed loyalty to command above accountability to law. Preventing future corruption required changing the institutional incentives that had made the Fort Davidson conspiracy possible. During her congressional testimony, Sarah described the moment she had realized the full scope of the conspiracy against her. Standing in that hospital room, surrounded by people who were either criminals or under the control of criminals, she had understood that her survival depended on her ability to fight a system that seemed designed to protect the powerful at the expense of the truth. That realization had led Sarah to dedicate her post-recovery career to ensuring that other military personnel wouldn't face the same impossible situation she had confronted. Her work with congressional committees, military reform organizations, and whistleblower advocacy groups had helped identify and correct dozens of institutional weaknesses that enable corruption and abuse. The impact of Sarah's advocacy extended beyond policy reform to cultural change within the military establishment. Her story had become required reading at officer candidate schools, where future military leaders studied how good people could become complicit in evil systems and how individual courage could challenge institutional corruption. Sarah's speaking engagements at military academies were among the most powerful and well-attended events in their educational programs. She spoke directly to future officers about the moral challenges they would face and the importance of maintaining integrity, even when doing so required enormous personal risk. Her message resonated with young military personnel who understood that they might someday face similar tests of character. The 3 generals who had orchestrated the cover-up were serving their prison sentences in different federal facilities, their military careers and reputations permanently destroyed. General Harrison, who had been considered a potential candidate for chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was working in the prison library and teaching literacy classes to fellow inmates. His fall from the pinnacles of military power to federal imprisonment served as a stark reminder of the consequences of corruption. General Kim had suffered a heart attack during his 2nd year of imprisonment and required ongoing medical care that added to the burdens of his confinement. His family had disowned him following his conviction, and his wife had divorced him and returned to her maiden name to escape the shame associated with his crimes. Kim's isolation and deteriorating health reflected the personal costs of his criminal choices. General Torres had initially attempted to maintain her innocence and appeal her conviction, but the overwhelming evidence against her had made legal challenges futile. She eventually accepted responsibility for her crimes and began participating in prison rehabilitation programs. Torres's letters to Sarah, expressing remorse for her role in the conspiracy and admiration for Sarah's courage, had been among the most unexpected developments in the aftermath of the case. Colonel Brennan's prison experience had been more difficult than that of the generals, partly because his role in directly assaulting Sarah made him a target for other inmates who despised violence against women. He had been placed in protective custody for his own safety and spent most of his time in solitary confinement. Brennan's descent from respected military officer to isolated federal prisoner illustrated the complete destruction that criminal choices could bring to a previously successful life. The ammunition theft operation that had triggered the entire conspiracy had been completely dismantled, with recovered weapons and munitions worth millions of dollars. The international arms dealing network that had purchased the stolen ammunition had been disrupted through cooperation with foreign law enforcement agencies. Several terrorist organizations and criminal groups had lost access to military-grade weapons that could have been used in attacks against civilian targets. Dr. Foster, the physician who had initially falsified Sarah's medical records, but later provided the anonymous tip that brought Attorney Walsh into the case, had found redemption through his work at a veterans hospital. Foster's experience with the moral compromises demanded by the conspiracy had made him a passionate advocate for medical ethics and patient rights. His testimony about the pressure he had faced to falsify Sarah's records had helped establish stronger protections for military medical personnel. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, the paramedic who had first questioned Sarah's injuries and been transferred to Alaska as punishment, had used her experience to become an advocate for emergency medical personnel who witnessed suspicious injuries. Rodriguez had testified before Congress about the importance of protecting medical professionals who report potential crimes, even when their observations challenge official narratives. Attorney Jennifer Walsh had leveraged the success of Sarah's case to establish a nonprofit legal organization dedicated to representing military whistleblowers and corruption victims. The Walsh Foundation provided free legal services to military personnel who faced retaliation for reporting criminal activity or misconduct. Sarah served on the foundation's board of directors and helped identify cases where the organization's intervention could prevent future tragedies. The anonymous arms dealers and security contractors who had purchased stolen ammunition from the Fort Davidson conspiracy had faced varying degrees of legal consequence. Some had cooperated with investigators and received reduced sentences, while others had fought the charges and received substantial prison terms. The criminal prosecutions had sent a clear message to the private security industry that purchasing weapons of questionable origin carried serious legal risks. Sarah's personal recovery from her injuries had been complete from a physical standpoint, though she continued to experience psychological effects from her trauma. She had undergone extensive therapy to process the violence she had experienced and the betrayal by people she had trusted. Sarah's willingness to discuss her ongoing struggles with post-traumatic stress had helped reduce the stigma associated with mental health treatment for military personnel. The safety deposit box where Sarah had stored copies of crucial evidence had become a symbol of the importance of preparation and foresight in confronting corruption. Military academies now taught courses on evidence preservation and secure communication methods that personnel could use if they discovered criminal activity within their organizations. Sarah's off-base apartment, where she had stored backup computer files that proved essential to the prosecution, had been preserved as evidence until after the trials concluded. When the apartment was returned to normal use, Sarah had donated the computer equipment to a military history museum as a reminder of how technology could be used to preserve truth in the face of institutional efforts to destroy evidence. The Congressional Committee's unanimous vote to approve the Chun Military Accountability Act marked a milestone in Sarah's ongoing efforts to prevent future corruption cases. The legislation would establish the institutional safeguards and cultural changes necessary to ensure that military personnel could report criminal activity without fear of retaliation or violence. Sarah's closing remarks to the Congressional Committee focused on the importance of individual responsibility in maintaining institutional integrity. She emphasized that laws and regulations could create frameworks for accountability, but that preventing corruption ultimately depended on the courage of individual military personnel to do the right thing even when doing so required personal sacrifice. The legacy of Sarah's case extended far beyond the specific reforms that bore her name. Her story had demonstrated that even the most powerful military conspiracies could be defeated by determined individuals willing to fight for justice. The three generals who had thought they could bury the truth along with a broken body had instead created a legacy of reform that would protect future generations of military personnel. Years of advocacy work had convinced Sarah that her survival and recovery had purposes beyond her personal healing. She had been given the opportunity to ensure that her suffering would prevent similar tragedies for others. The stairs where she had nearly died had become the foundation for reforms that would make the military more accountable, more transparent, and more worthy of the trust placed in it by the American people. Sarah's final reflection on her experience emphasized the unpredictable nature of courage and the importance of preparation for moral challenges that might seem impossible when they arise. She had never expected to face a situation where her own military colleagues would try to murder her for discovering the truth. But when that situation arose, her commitment to integrity and justice had enabled her to survive and ultimately prevail. The woman who had been pushed down concrete stairs for asking inconvenient questions had become the architect of systemic changes that would protect future military personnel from facing similar dangers. Sarah's transformation from victim to advocate represented the triumph of individual courage over institutional corruption, and her legacy would endure long after the criminals who had tried to silence her had been forgotten. The truth that Sarah had almost died protecting had not only been preserved but had become the foundation for a more just and accountable military system. Her survival and determination had proved that no conspiracy is too powerful to be challenged, and that sometimes a single person's refusal to accept injustice can change an entire institution. In the end, the three generals who had thought they could control the narrative by eliminating an inconvenient witness had instead created the most powerful advocate for military reform in a generation. Sarah's story would continue inspiring future generations of military personnel to choose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and justice over loyalty to corrupt authority.